This is the College of Arts and Media podcast, episode 2, with Mr. Johny Fernandez, a reporter with WFTV in Orlando and an SEU alumnus, and Professor Adrienne Garvey, assistant professor of broadcasting with the Department of Communication within the College of Arts and Media at Southeastern University. My name is Donnie Edwards, and I will be hosting our podcast today. I'm the College Advancement and Creative Lead for the College of Arts and Media at Southeastern University. Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Today we're going to talk about journalism. More specifically, we're going to talk about trauma in journalism. First, I think it would be beneficial for everyone listening if you each introduce yourselves and gave a short overview of your background and what you do. So, ladies first, let's take it.
Okay. So before I started teaching, I worked in the TV news industry for about 13 years. I worked at 3 different TV stations, doing pretty much every job there is to do in a TV station except except weather and sports. I really wasn't interested in either of those, but learning all of the different steps really kind of made me more well-rounded in the field, which was kind of cool. I've had a really interesting, broad experience, I should say, I guess, in television. So most of my time was spent as a producer, but early in my career, I was a reporter for a couple of years. And then at the end of my career, I actually had moved up into management at one of the top-rated TV stations in the country. So I have an undergrad degree in communication studies from Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri, and I have a Master of Electronic Media, Master of Science in Electronic Media from Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, and I'm in the tail end of my dissertation in communication, my PhD in communication at Regent University. I am working on my dissertation, which is why I went there. So, but my field of study is actually trauma in journalism. So my heart in my research is to create what I call a toolbox of things that we can give to journalists to help them cope with some of the things that they experience, some of the things that they see in their everyday job. Journalists are often overlooked when it comes to mental health. A lot of people don't realize that we're standing right alongside the first responders at these crime scenes and repeated, every day. We just go back to another one, and it builds up after a while, and it's time we start paying attention to the mental health of our journalists. So that's where my heart is in my research, and I'm actually really enjoying it, much to my surprise. Research is not my favorite thing.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that today with our topic.
Sure.
So,
Cool.
Johnny, how about you?
Well, my resume isn't that extensive, but I graduated from Southeastern in 2013 with a degree in broadcasting, and then from there started about 6 months after graduation in Market 78, Huntsville, Alabama. Worked at It was like the number 2 station. I think just went back and forth with the number 1, number 2 station. So I was a one-man band there in a bureau, the Muscle Shoals Bureau, and it covered the towns of Tuscumbia, Sheffield, and Muscle Shoals. So it was awesome first job out of college. So pretty much did that for about a year, and then from there I was able to jump up back to Orlando and work for the CBS station in Orlando, and I was primarily the breaking news one-man band reporter for that station. Did that for 3 years, or 2 years and 11 months. It's like 3 years, rounded up to 3 years. So woke up at 1 a.m. every day and would be in bed by midday, like noon, and then pretty much had a nocturnal life. So it was interesting, to say the least. I mean, I saw a lot of cool things, a lot of interesting things covered, pretty much a good variety of stories. And then from there, I was able to cross the street and go over to the dominant station in Orlando, WFTV, the ABC affiliate there. And I've been there about almost 2 years, about a year and like 8 months around that time gap. So been there that long, and just kind of doing the same thing, but specifically now covering more of the growing Osceola County section of the market. So been focusing on that, but also do the morning show, the weekend morning shows. So been kind of doing that for a year and some change, and it's been fun. It's been interesting seeing how like the industry's changed, and seeing how just in a short amount of time, I think it's been like 5-6 years, just how things have changed from when I graduated from Southeastern to where we're at now. So it's kind of been my journey along the way. So
both of you have had interesting journeys so far.
yeah.
So I think where I'd like to start in the conversation is let's just talk about what is journalism and what makes people want to be journalists. We've talked about the kind of a little bit touched on in your stories, the kind of lifestyle that they live to serve the community in that way. So maybe we can talk about what's journalism technically. What is it to you, and what made you all want to be journalists?
I'm nosy.
Yeah. Same. I think it's the curiosity factor of it. There like I remember growing up, I was always asking questions and always like wanting to, figure out why certain things are the way they are. Um, and then I was also what caught my attention was being like seeing the news. Like my parents would always watch the news and seeing the guys out there in the big stories, like crazy brush fires or just like these national stories. And I was like, oh, that's such a cool story, like that's such a cool job because you're never at a desk. So I think journalism to me is definitely just um being a public servant and like informing the community, whether it's national or local, about what's going on. And also you have the responsibility of getting them answers and getting those questions that linger around and just pretty much informing them of what's going on. And it's interesting in our generation because I'm definitely considered a millennial. How millennials take up journalism and see and how they process the news now. And I think it's all still the same concept. Like everyone wants to know what's going on, but it's just taken a different approach on it now. So that's journalism to me.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think for me, it's funny because, like, honestly, just the last few weeks, I was thinking about what was it? Because I know
Yeah.
why did I get involved in journalism? Because I mean, there's a lot of journalists who are like, I always knew I wanted to be on TV my whole life.
That was not the case.
Not
Yeah.
me either.
I was a pre-med student here at Southeastern for like the first semester.
Wow, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
Yeah, that never was my thing, but I love to write, and I've always loved to write, and it comes very naturally to me. So to me, that was kind of the click. But then I got to thinking about what I watched as a kid. I watched Dateline as a kid. I was
Yeah.
that kid. So like Jane Pauley was my idol. I kind of forgot about that. But that's why I got involved. I loved the story. I loved the detail. I loved the storytelling. And then as I got into journalism, I definitely saw the public service side of it. And there were days where you think it's not the most what's the word I'm looking for? Well, glamorous, yeah. And sometimes you just feel like you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
Like, am I really helping?
Yeah.
And then you have like where one of the stations I worked at was up north, and we'd have blizzards. You'd have a blizzard, and you've got these, elderly people, let's say, whose electricity is shut off because they can't afford to pay their bill. Well, I know how to help them get their bill paid so that their electricity comes back on, so that they're not sitting in their apartments or homes without
Yeah.
electricity during a blizzard. That's helping. And
Yeah.
that to me was extremely fulfilling. It seems so little, but it really isn't.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of times when you work in the news industry, you forget. Like you're like, oh, it's just a job, or like there's just a lot of things like when you work in news that you go through and you're just like the everyday is just sometimes grueling. I mean, it takes a toll on your body mentally, physically, and then you get days when like I was at the supermarket the other day and literally I'm with my shopping cart just shopping and doing normal people things, and then I have this lady, I've never met her in my life. She comes up to me, she's like, oh my gosh, Johny Fernandez, I watch you every weekend morning. I love you, I love Channel 9, I love what you guys do, you guys get answers, you guys are one of the most reliable sources that we have, period. And I like looked at her and she gave me a hug, and it's like she knew me, but I had never met her.
Yep.
But it's one of those things, it's like moments like that I take it into consideration when I have like really bad days or crappy days, and you're just like, what am I doing with my life? But then you go back to those moments and people like legit have this sense of like trust in the news, even though like it's changing now, like the perspective. But I think at the end of the day, when something big happens, people still rely on local news to get the information. And there's this trust that it's kind of not seen, but it's still there. It's kind of like it reminds me of like a parent and a child type of trust. Like you turn on for Orlando, you turn on at 6 o'clock to see Greg Warmouth, who's been there for like 25 years. Like people trust, I trust him. Before I worked at Channel 9, I would always watch, Greg and Vanessa. And now working with them, it's like they've been this like staple in our community, and there's this trust factor. It's insane to think that like Johny from like that graduated at Southeastern at when I was 21, that like I have this people trust me, and I take that pretty seriously. It's just like a trust factor and a responsibility that I kind of took on very early on in life.
Is
So,
it not the weirdest thing though when you're shopping and somebody recognizes you and you're like,
it's
please
so
just
strange.
leave me alone?
And sometimes
Yes.
I'm in like a hoodie and my glasses and like my basketball shorts.
Incognito.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But it's awesome though, because it's so cool to just see them, and just like they know I'm a normal person. Like I'm not like this crazy like uptight like individual. It's like, hey, how's it going? And I love meeting people, because then they share their stories with you and vice versa, and then there's another connection that comes on. So it's pretty cool.
So, as people of faith, how does that come into your journalistic pursuits? I mean, if we're just talking generally about the lifestyle, your interest in it, I mean, did that play a factor in wanting to be a journalist, or at least how you do journalism? Does that change things for you in the workplace?
To an extent. I mean, I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to win these people to Jesus. For me,
Yeah.
it was my calling. So, I mean, the Lord made it very clear. This is where you're to go. So that's where I went. And he's the one who opened doors for me. And I think of the people that I've been exposed to, not just my coworkers, but in the community. And what I've found is that they're more receptive to Christians. At least this is my experience. I can't speak broadly, but because we just have a natural compassion. There's something about us, because we have the traits of Jesus, that makes them trust us. It makes them want to talk to us. To this day, I mean, I've been out of journalism since the end of 2010. To this day, I have people who I don't know who will come up to me and just spill. And then they say, I don't know why I just said that. It's like I've had to learn outside of news to be kind of a vault and try to keep people's stuff private, but be a safe place for them. So I suspect the Lord's going to use that down the road. And if it's where I think it is, I think it's really cool. But I don't know, for me, like I never went up going, oh, let me pray with you. But I know journalists who have done that. I do know like Christian journalists. After the tornado in Joplin in 2011, it was an EF5, leveled like a third of the city, killed like 161 people. I mean, it was violent. And that was one of the markets I had worked in. So we went back 3 months later and helped tear down houses, because that was our community. Like those were our friends. One of my journalist friends' homes was directly in the path of the tornado. It was pulled up from around him. But as I interviewed the journalist, because I was doing a study on repeated exposure to a traumatic event, one of the journalists said the night she started, she was driving around, and the first home she came to that had damage to it was a single mom with two kids. And she's like, the house was just destroyed. And this mom is beside herself and doesn't know what to do. And she said, my first instinct was to pray with her. And I did. And I was like, good for you. I think we're seeing more of that today, because the face of journalism has shifted. I think some of it has to do with how we're receiving it. It's less formal. So like everything's digital, everything's mobile. And, you see journalists cry on the air today, which you would never have seen 20 years ago. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's just, for me, that's how it was. That's how I lived my faith through what I did. I was not perfect. Oh my goodness, I have regrets.
Yeah.
But, I did the best I could.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what was it like for you?
No, I think for me, I mean, I think it's interesting, because I've walked into journalism and I started my career at a point in time when it started to change drastically. And like you said, like now it's okay to be more personable.
Mm-hmm.
versus back in the day when everyone was like suit and tie and like you couldn't like cry,
Hmm.
you couldn't speak your opinion. And I think there's always that fine line. But I think for me personally, like it's been one of those things that my faith has played a role in how I write my stories. And I always try to do my best to not be biased or not try to show too much, but pretty much be neutral. But I think kind of like what you said, that it does there's something about it, and I think it's definitely like the fruits of the spirit. Um, People are drawn to you for some
Yes.
reason. And to me, like I try to live my faith on a regular basis, and do spend my alone time with God, and have my devotions and things like that. But I think just there's certain things that are ingrained in us as Christians that people draw to us, and then people talk to us and confine in us, and it's just interesting how people notice and they tell me like there's something different about you that when your other colleagues come and cover certain stories, it's not the same. And I, to be honest, like I know what it is, but obviously they don't know. And I think I remember someone told me like you're just such a nice person, and you get the job done, but you get it done in a in a fair way. And I was like, all right. And I think especially when people see me on TV, I've had people tell me there's just like a presence about you that um, there's just something different. And I know it's all the grace, and it's all God and Jesus just being reflected in my daily walk and my job. And but yeah, it's true. Like there's this compassion factor in it. And especially when I cover like shootings or stabbings or like the crime aspect of things. I always take into consideration number one what this family is going through. If I was going through that, like how would I want people to approach me? But then also the spiritual aspect of things, and especially when a big traumatic event happens, it's so real for us Christians to see the spiritual aspect of it that it's definitely prayer is like a huge thing. And that's I do incorporate that like before I go live or when there's a story like a big story like that. I've always made it a point like you have to pray and cover yourself with the blood of Christ and pretty much do everything my parents taught us to do
Hmm.
as kids.
Yep.
To incorporate it because I've seen it play out in my life and it's just made such a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like you would assume. I think that it's very integral to practicing journalism that you really are just serving the public. You can't,
Right.
at a
It's a
certain point, you
service.
can't really separate yourself from the job. Like
Yeah.
you are in the community, and that's it.
I think one of the things that we sometimes, I don't know about you, but like I've seen, I didn't experience this as a reporter that I can remember. Um, Maybe a little more as a producer because I was writing from court documents that were pretty graphic.
Yeah.
But from an ethical standpoint, what do you reveal? We always know more than we tell you as the
Yeah.
general public. So even that filter, I think, has Christ embedded in it. Like
Yeah.
again, like kind of like what you said with I'm going to take into account how are these people feeling.
Yeah.
So there is almost a level of protection that I felt like I needed to protect some of that information. It wasn't really necessary in the story. I could get the story across without giving it away because it might have been even more harmful to the victims.
Yeah, and I think for me, a struggle I've had is when you have those court documents that reveal these crazy graphic
They're horrid.
details. How do you approach it? And I've had arguments with my bosses, and it's just like
Yes.
I don't feel comfortable doing that, and or they'll we'll have a discussion about why they believe it should be said, and I just that my approach has been different on certain stories, and it's cost me trips to the office to have like chats with the bosses, and I've sat down with them and we're like, this is why I did this, and you leave sometimes feeling like, man, did I do the right thing? But I know at the end of the day, like I go home and I'm like, you know what, I did my best and that's all I can do.
We have to sleep at night.
Yeah.
So like if that's the spirit leading,
Yeah.
if you feel you're supposed to do something a certain way, you do it because he'll protect you on the other end of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So, really, then your reporting and kind of your day reflects the state of the world, at least in that area of the world that you're in, that one part. So how does life change as a journalist when the world is violent and chaotic? We've kind of touched on that. You mentioned stabbings or shootings or anything else. I mean, what does that do to journalists? We see journalists covering, victims, to use that word, or just the public. And we talked about how journalists are there with the first responders. Um, I mean, how do journalists deal with it? Do you have
Not well.
do you have training to deal with to cope with some of these things, or like, hey, your boss, the chief or something just says, hey, this is what you're going to go see, and this is how you deal with it, or or is it just kind of, hey, go cover this, and then you go home and now you have to sort out the fact that you saw this crazy car wreck and no one made it out, or how do you what is that like, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I think for someone that when I left Southeastern and I went to like a local market, it was my first story, and it was like a crazy story where someone was murdered, their body was taken, dumped over a river, and they found the body, and they had me, and they did stuff to the body, and it was pretty graphic, and they had me do it, and I was just like in a total state of shock. I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know how to process this.
Mhm.
So I think as time goes on, for me at least, it created definitely a shock factor, but at the same time, because being a Christian, like I've had to learn to just give a lot of things to Christ, and it just creates. It's hard to explain. It creates this. You at one point get numb to it, but also have to remember that like it is your job, and you can't get numb to it. You also have to like be compassionate and like get somewhat invested in the story. But I think for other journalists, what I've seen it allows habits to be created that for some journalists it's not healthy. But then for other journalists, like I feel like they end up finding a plug or an outlet to kind of help them release the stress or like just the graphicness of what just happened for the day. Because a lot of times it is like very graphic, and it's like like what we've talked about. We're right by police officers and firefighters and like the FBI or in scenarios like that where it's just a lot to take in, and I don't think at work or at school they really prepare you to just process all that. And I think as people go on in their career, they learn, and they learn how to cope, they learn how to handle the stress, um, and it just creates, I think, just this pattern of, I guess, stress for a lot of people. It creates this like stress pattern, but at the same time, it allows you to just figure out how to deal with it, if that makes any sense.
Or not, I
Or
would
not,
Or
guess, in
yeah.
not.
some
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in the exact same boat as you, right out of school, just a few years earlier though. um, but I actually had my first reporting job before I graduated from college. I had a really good internship the fall of my senior year, and they hired me that spring to do part-time reporting, and then I was on the assignment desk, I think one night a week or something like that, which was awesome. But I was completely unprepared for even though I had a great internship and I had seen some stuff through my internship. Once I got into my job and it was on me to really get the story right, my first dead body was a hanging. It was a young man who had hung himself off the back of the press box at a local high school. And thank God I had a photographer with me that day, which is unusual. And we heard it on the scanners. We get over there and the body's still there. There's a crowd gathered. And I won't say what he said, but my photographer made kind of a crass joke. And I was like, I was taken aback by that. With some perspective now, that's that gallows humor. That's some of the coping that we see journalists doing is we have a very dark sense of humor, and that sticks with you after you leave, by the way. But it's one of our ways of coping with what we're seeing. I know alcohol's a big one. It's a really big one, and it's just not healthy. Excessive alcohol drinking, alcohol intake. What happens a lot of times is that journalists will compartmentalize while they're working. Like you said, we have a job to do. We've got to get it done, whatever. What happens then, though, is it hits us afterwards. So, like, I covered the Amish school shooting, and while we were covering it, it was very surreal. And usually our newsrooms are chaotic when there's breaking news. Like, they're loud, people are running, people are yelling. It's crazy. That day it was quiet. Nobody was saying a word. It was very, very quiet in the newsroom. And we all felt, excuse me, we took it personally because that was our community, and the Amish are considered so innocent. And it was just a really odd feeling. And I watched my coworkers kind of go through their day. I got called in on my day off to help cover that. And we got about halfway through the day, and then one of our anchors lost it on the air. And then you started to see some emotion come out, but even still, we still had a job to do. So I thought I'd go home early evening, and they said, "Hey, can you stay and produce the 11 o'clock news?" I was like, "Oh, okay, this is my day off." So I stayed and produced the news, and the last call I made before we went on the air was to the coroner to find out how many of the girls had died. I'm like, that will stick with me forever. That's a horrible thing to have to do, a horrible phone call to have to make. And I think once we all got out to our cars that night, there were a lot of people sitting in the parking lot crying, because we don't want to show emotion most of the time in front of our colleagues. There's this macho attitude in newsrooms because we're so competitive. That doesn't leave after you leave the news either. But we're competing against our peers for the next big story. You want that lead story. And what journalists have said in the research is that they don't want to appear weak. And if they show that they're not handling it well, they're afraid they'll get pulled from it, and then they won't get another big story. It's that competitive drive that almost leads to some very unhealthy coping mechanisms. So what I saw later in the week actually was, I think it happened on a Tuesday, if I remember correctly. I started to see little pods of people gathering around the newsroom talking to each other. And it was like peer support. I didn't recognize it at the time because I hadn't dug into research or anything yet, but it's peer support. And that was a huge coping mechanism that worked really, really well in that newsroom. But we don't get debriefed. We don't get taught, from the university side.
Yeah.
I am bound and determined that none of my journalism students will leave this school without having some exposure to trauma and journalism. Here's what you're going to see. I'm going to tell you some rough stuff. I'm going to show you some rough stuff, because you need to know this is what you're going to see, and I don't want you to be shocked like I was.
And I think the shock factor of it,
Yeah.
it hits you so hard,
Mm-hmm.
especially like out of college, like the first couple of years, you're just like,
Yeah.
and I think depending on stories, and especially if it involves kids,
Yes.
that's something that just like, I remember there was one specific story. It was a crazy family situation. The mom had divorced the father, and they were in the process of just like kind of splitting everything, and the kids were with the mom, and the mom went on a date, but the dad ended up hiding in the trunk. So when she got out of when she finished the date had wrapped up, he popped out of the trunk, pretty much ran her over, killed her, and then went to pick up the kids from the nanny, and then ended up going off I-4 and then killing the kids, killed himself. And it was this crazy
My
like
goodness.
story where a lot of moving parts were going on, and the interstate was shut down, but there was a crime scene, and we all connected it pretty quickly. But I remember, I will never forget this, that when we found out that he ended up killing his two kids, they were under the age of 2. Like, it was just this like shock. Like, and you can hear it, and the public information officer kind of walked us through what happened, and we were just all just like, oh my gosh, like, how could you do that? And I remember that day, for some reason, like, I couldn't sleep. I slept for like 4 hours, and I woke up, and I remember I had a dream about like that story, and I turned on the TV and it's still there. And it's just this crazy, like, you don't know what to do, because you're like, those are not my kids, but still it's, they're kids. They're innocent lives. I think, like what you said, like, there is some type of peer support depending on the story, but for the most part, everyone's kind of trying to, like, outdo everyone and not break down, or not show at least that you're weak. And I think, you learn how to figure out that at the end of the day, if you do break down and kind of show that you're a human, it'll make you better in the long run. But sometimes it might not be beneficial to do it in the newsroom,
Right.
because there is this macho attitude where it's just like, I'm here first, or like I can handle it. And yeah.
We have yet to learn in the newsrooms that it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it a little more accepted. It's becoming more acceptable is probably the best word, but it's not the first reaction.
Definitely not.
And that's what needs to change.
Yeah.
And in the I'm going to put a lot of this on management, and I'm coming from a manager's shoes because that was the last role I had. I know how they think, and I know they're driven, and they have a plan, and they're linear, and we're going to do this, 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 and this, and they forget about these outlying factors. And so you almost need to have somebody in the newsroom who can think outside of that linear plan of getting the job done to, oh, hey, what are some of the other things that we need to be considering? What are some of the warning signs that I need to be watching for? And again, this is it. I do see more newsrooms doing it, which is really good, but I know there are plenty that don't as well.
So, have you, I guess, have you observed in your own career that I would imagine there's some situations where, as a journalist, it's challenge your worldview or the way that you've seen the world, or maybe the way you see certain people, or the way you see a city. I mean, there's different cultures in every city, and maybe you grew up on a different side of town, or you did whatever, and like, how has that worked? I mean, you talked about like the Amish, right? You're not Amish. So
Thank you for recognizing that.
How did that? We have no video. She's not Amish. But how did that? I mean, did that make you more compassionate to that community, or was there another event beforehand that did? I mean, through exposure to these people, and you get to know them and their story. Does that change how you see the world in your community? I mean, does that challenge you in that way?
That was my home community, so I grew up around the Amish. I was already very protective of them. I hate when tourists come in town and try to take their pictures. If you know anything about the Amish, they consider that a violation of the 10 Commandments. And that was hard. Like during the Amish school shooting, when all the national media kind of converged on us, our news director pulled us all aside and said, "You stay above reproach. You know what's acceptable and what's not. You know where the lines are and where they aren't. When this is all said and done, all those guys leave. You have to stay here. You still have to work in this community, and you need them to respect you." And they did. Like that was such a great newsroom. They respected the Amish community. We ended up actually getting interviews with some of the Amish parents, television cameras. Now, we didn't show their faces. We, did silhouettes, and we're respectful of that. But what a story, because we were protective of them, and we were respectful of them. So I wouldn't say it necessarily changed my perspective. It gave me a different way to look at it, which was interesting. I think the thing that probably the area that I was most educated in, if you will, when it comes to my news career was different socioeconomic status. And how not everybody has it so good, and that to me actually built my compassion for people. And it, not that I felt sorry for them, but it made me think of things differently. It made me approach things differently. And honestly, a lot of it built my faith a lot, because I would see things I didn't understand, and I'd immediately, question, why is this okay? Why do you let this happen? So it was a very interesting spiritual growth for me on that side of it.
Yeah, and I think for me, I covered the Pulse shooting. That I think till this day is probably one of the biggest mass shootings ever. And covering it from start to finish, from like the time they got the call, and so it happened on a Saturday, Sunday morning, and I ended up going into work Sunday night into Monday morning. I was out of town, so I flew back and whatnot. And I think it was an interesting story to cover because, um, as a Christian, there's certain views on like the LGBTQ community, and then you walk into this scenario where the lifestyle that people live don't necessarily line up with the lifestyle that I live or I was raised up to believe that we should live a certain lifestyle. um and I think that week it made me question a lot about, like, all right, like, how should I approach this, how should I treat this? Because um I think the big thing I got out of it was to be compassionate,
Hmm.
because at the end of the day what I saw was that we're all humans, um and Christ would always associate with people that weren't necessarily, you know, the best people to the eyes of the community, or that he would always associate himself with people that didn't align with his walk of life. And what I saw in that week specifically were parents, and specifically I remember that night when all the shooting happened, it was Hispanic, it was Latino. I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino. So, I would see parents worried about if their son or daughter got shot and is dead. I remember covering and talking to different family members, and they're like, we don't know if, if so and so is alive or dead. Like, I remember one of the days I was close to the hospital, and everyone was just waiting to hear, because there were so many people inside the club that the FBI and like forensics and everyone was still processing the scene. So they didn't have names of who was gone and who was there, um, and who's alive and who's not. And it took a while, but I remember seeing like the parents coming out, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and a lot of them just shocked. And then I kind of went back and it traced back to like my family. If something like this was to happen in like a church or like a school or anything like that, this would be my family worried about me trying to figure out if I was dead or alive. And it As a week went on, I started to reflect a lot more. And I think the word that comes to mind is grace. Just because certain people don't live a lifestyle that I may necessarily live doesn't mean that like I have to like execute them from, you know, telling their story and giving them a fair chance, because at the end of the day, we're all humans, and people need love regardless of what they live, how they live, who they choose to be. And that was something I had to process, because I was like, what do honestly, like, my first reaction every time I would get out of the car is like, what do I do? Like, if I report this, do I agree with the lifestyle? If not, do I not agree with that? But am I doing my job? And it was just like, you're torn. You're literally torn. Um, but I had to learn compassion and grace. And I had to learn it quickly, because it's like, hey, you're live in like an hour. Like, in your life for like 10, 20, minutes. Like, let's say you're going, you're going, you're going. And it was a lot of grace and compassion, to be honest. And I'm glad I went through that, because it teaches you, number one, to approach people correctly in a scenario like that, when it's just like the most traumatic or shocking day of their life. And also, it teaches you that this is a job, but at the same time, like, it's okay to be human, and it's okay to hug someone or to cry with someone because they've lost someone. And it's I've recently lost family members, and just that pain, it's just like inevitable that your heart's just broken. But finding out the way they did, it was just a completely different, you know stage of shock. And then the other mass shooting I covered was back in, I want to say, 2016, 2015, 2016. It was the Fiamma workplace shooting. That was pretty much a disgruntled worker went back to his workplace, shot up four or five of his coworkers and his boss. And it was in the morning. I was covering the morning news that day, and we got calls that there were some shots fired, and we were close by, and we started seeing a bunch of police cars and deputy cars just fly to this one place, and we didn't have much of the details, but we knew that there was something big going on. And they called me. They're like, "Hey, you're live in like 5 minutes. Go with what you have." Mind you, I didn't have anything, and this was kind of like it turned into like a 24-hour, like it was like wall to wall coverage. And then I just kind of went with my gut instinct. I was like, all right, like describe what you see, describe where you see the cops coming out of, what's going on, and then we find out the details. And that story shook me to my core because of the simple fact that it goes back to mental health and how people deal with traumatic events, because that specific person was a disgruntled worker that he clearly didn't like his workplace. He wanted to get revenge or whatever he wanted to get back at his boss and manager. And the story unfolded, and it was like intense because it's like, wow, like this could be anyone. Like this could be, the person I sit next to in my cubicle.
And then it happened at WDBJ
Yeah.
in Roanoke
Yeah.
when there was the disgruntled employee shot the reporter and the photographer when they were on a live shot.
And completely and it wasn't even, they weren't even mad at them. They were just mad at their workplace.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because that story, it's like, it was one of those things that for the first time I was like leading like the newscast, and I was leading the wall-to-wall coverage, and that felt good because I know network was watching and everyone was watching, but at the same time it was just one of those things that you had to like figure out, like, all right, you just can't, it's okay to be weak and be human and communicate to the public that, like, here's what we know, we don't know much, and kind of address the family members too in a way that you don't scare them off and just like completely give them the shock value of news, but just kind of work to it. I think a lot of this is people skills.
It is.
What I've learned,
Yeah.
what I've learned about like all these traumatic stories is that at the end of the day, it's all people skills, and
Yep.
just knowing how to like properly speak with them and not hit them so hard with the news when it's not necessary.
Right.
So, thank you for sharing that, by the way. But that experience, that's both of you. I think that's a lot of things that we don't hear about.
Yeah.
'Cause that journalists don't cover themselves.
And this is part of the reason I get so frustrated with, excuse me, how journalists are viewed in the country right now as dishonest, and they're skewing the news and blah blah blah. Unfortunately that probably is happening to some extent, but there are more good journalists out there than there are bad, and this is who we are. Johnny and I both have had very similar experiences, probably a decade or more apart, which tells you something. This is not an anomaly for either of us. This is the nature of what news looks like. You have a lot of compassionate, kind people who want to get it right. And when we don't, we try to fix it. I'm going off on a rabbit trail a little bit, but I just feel like that's an important thing for people to see, is that we are human and we do have the community's best at heart.
Right. Well, and what do you think that there's a difference between covering these tragic events, these traumatic events, right, that almost seem to surpass opinion, right? There's one opinion to have about those kind of
Right,
things, I
right.
mean, I guess there's more than one, but generally people that are decent people are going to have one opinion about those things, and
Right.
that it's tragic. Do you think it's different, that the culture of journalism is different when we get to things like politics or policy or economics, finance, any of those things, business, that maybe they're less humanizing?
Right.
Unfortunately, I think politics should be very humanizing, but that's
Yeah.
my opinion. But do you think there is a different journalistic culture there between those two things?
I definitely think so.
That
Yeah.
journalists are different when they're handling a shooting versus an election?
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
I think so. And I think it's just because, like, when it comes to stories like politics, finances, things that are, I guess, not your general GA.
Right.
Sometimes, because I think
General
usually
assignment
general
is what they
assignment,
General assignment, okay.
general assignment, I think they usually get like the day of, but like when you specialize, you kind of
Right.
get into like a certain niche. I think it's different because it's not skewed one way or the other. It can be,
Hmm.
but at the same time, um, I think that it's more of a cycle. I guess like they're kind of more in a structured cycle, and it's it's different.
It is
It
different.
yeah.
It's less adrenaline driven. When you see the breaking news and the big stories, I I kept thinking adrenaline junkies when you were
Yeah.
asking about like what journalists are. Well, we're adrenaline junkies. Like we love stuff like that. Breaking news is our life. But some people love the political side of it, and that is so much more information to process.
Yes.
I mean,
It's so structured. It's
oh my
so
goodness.
yeah, and I think where I'm at now, I'm working at WFTV, and they're very process driven, and like stories about like county finances
Hmm.
and taxes, or
Which are
like
important.
no, which is interesting because I think I will definitely say this as a student. I used to think like those stories are so boring, but at the end of the day, like you always find someone that it affects.
Right.
Like, and it's the craziest thing where like you can recently, like 2 weeks ago, there was like a penny sales tax that was going on in Osceola County, and I covered it for some time, and there was always an opinion, or like you can always find someone that it affects directly, and it's just interesting because it is structured. It is very
Hmm.
like here's like what you like the documents show like the
Right.
fundings and the spending of the funds and or like the political aspect of who's running for what and but it is structured based and there's not much adrenaline
Right.
there.
Well, and with breaking news, there's really only, like you said, there's only one way to look at
Yeah,
that. It,
like
it is
it's
what it is. It literally is black and white. It is a shooting, it is a
and
stabbing,
that's it.
whatever. But when you get into the other things, when you have so much information to
A
process,
little more
they have
nuance.
clear two sides to them.
Yeah.
That's where you run into the problem, and where you don't have sometimes you don't have a fair balance of each side. And
Even though you try to like present it,
yes,
but it's
people
still
hear what they want to hear.
yeah.
That's what you find out is that, and it's funny because people, Americans in general, just need to start taking responsibility for checking fake news. It's not that hard. Literally last night, my daughter said something to me, and I'm like, "Let me see that." And she gave it to me. She's 15, hands me her phone with the story, and I'm reading the story, and I'm like, "This is the most ridiculous thing ever." So I scrolled all the way down to the bottom of the website, clicked to the about side. The first sentence is, "This is a satirical website." And I handed it back to her and showed it to her. And I said, "And you just learned how to check for fake news." So she just rolled her eyes and went, "Oh, great." So,
But I think with that being said, the public, the viewers now, they kind of try to hold you accountable,
right.
but at the same time, they should also hold
Yes.
themselves accountable because there's so much different avenues and so much different things they could use to check it.
Yep.
I mean, besides like just the regular local news and network news, you have, everything online from like social media to
Yep.
Google to YouTube and podcasts. And there's just like
Anybody can have a website
wealth
today.
Multiple
of
sources.
information.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, it's definitely,
Check your sources.
yeah.
Hmm.
So.
Okay.
We're going to tell you to always go local because I at least I will. I think local is bar none the best. You may not get the in-depth international and national. You'll get some taste of it, but ultimately you need to know what's going on in your community, and those people live in your community. They have a vested interest in getting it right because you're going to run into them at the grocery store.
Yeah. Well,
So-
I can attest to that. I mean, so where I'm at now, pretty much everyone has a designated county, cities, and they have to cover it. Like after this, I'm going to a city council meeting at 6:30 to see what's on the agenda.
That sounds exciting.
But no, I mean, yeah, local reporters, they are generally just invested to see what the story is and like how it's gonna affect, like Andy and Sandy that live in like, Montgomery Circle and are like 81 years old. So yeah, and as a local reporter, I can say that, we put a lot of work into coming up with these story ideas and coming up with pitches for the editorial meeting because that's our job. And I think the bosses will definitely pick out if you copied something from someone else,
Right.
and they'll be like, "Oh, that's already been done. What other new avenue angle story do you have for today? And
Back
you're
to the
like,
competition.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it's
Yeah.
interesting how local news works.
Mhm.
So I'd love to get back a little more directly to the trauma
Mhm.
in journalism. I had another question about that. So I was surprised to hear that newsrooms don't really have any protocol for coping with these kind of things, or programs set up for dealing with the stress of the job and the traumatic things that you may most likely will see as a journalist. So, what are some things that could be done to promote healthy coping mechanisms in the newsroom, or what's some things now if a journalism student's listening, or maybe somebody that wants to be a journalist or somebody that is a journalist is listening? What are some things they can do to cope with the stress of that job, whether or not they have active protocol support from their newsroom or the organization, the media group, whatever?
So I think covering Pulse, that was the first time I saw the managers at the station where I was working at, where they actually, they did bring in counselors, but it was just for the week. Um, and I think that was it for us. It was just the counselors. I may be wrong. But from what I had saw, because I was working in the early morning of the shows, so I was gone by like 12, 1 o'clock. But yeah, so they did bring in counseling because it was just so traumatic for everyone. It was the community got hit with this, mass shooting, and it was crazy because it was like right in the heart of Orlando, like right like by the downtown area. So it's a common place where we all used to, like, we still all drive by there. Everyone drives by to like get to like downtown, or like the Dunkin' Donuts or the Albert bagel shop that's right there. Um so yeah, so and I think amongst ourselves we talked about it, but I think some healthy coping mechanisms that people can take on their own is, number one, definitely use the resources that they have through their insurance. Because something I just recently found out was, you pay your monthly deductible for your insurance, and it's usually to go to the doctor. But if you actually call to find out what it offers, it does offer things like, therapy and counseling and things like that. So I think if anyone is struggling with that, or anyone's trying to figure out how do you deal with all this, is, you pick up the phone and you call and you figure out, what it is your insurance has to offer, because that is, I guess, technically part of like the newsroom. Like, even though it's not directly there, but the resources are there. And I think, just as in my personal like life, what I've done is, I've either had to like find a way to disconnect completely from work, and start going to the gym, or start doing like group things like Orange Theory or F45 or whatever, just to get your mind away from it. Because it helps, like doing those things like exercising, something it's simple that I used to think it's like, oh, it's whatever. But on days like that where you're super stressed and you just go and you let like everything out, you come back and you feel different. Like you feel different. And I think another big thing, especially if a journalist is a believer of whether it's Christianity or Buddhism, or anything of that, or any religion, to find a community where they can associate their faith with, or whatever the higher being is, because that also helps just process the day to day. And especially when you're covering a traumatic thing on a regular basis, like you need an outlet of people that, to me, I believe, that are not your coworkers, especially in a newsroom, because it's just, when you meet up with your newsroom buddies, you end up talking about work, and then it's just like this cycle of like work, 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 and it's just like, I am a journalist, but also I'm a human being too. Like I'm a normal person, you know, that I just want to have fun and be normal and find people with similar interests. So like the gym, you have a group setting that, wants to work out and wants to take care of their body. But I don't know, the spiritual aspect of things, that's a huge thing for me, because that's helped me get through like covering crazy stories and just dealing with different seasons of life. Because they will be there to like lift your spirit up, and it's a phenomenal. I will always be an advocate for finding a group, a community of whatever your belief is. Because I know not everyone's Christian, so yeah, especially in the newsroom. So
Right.
That's my
And
coping.
that's what I've found in my own research. It's very similar to that. The Joplin study that I did is probably the most um, it was the most clear cut and very focused on what are you doing to cope, or what did you do to cope. So I did that study 4 years after the tornado, but they all had to drive through the scene for 4 years to get to work. So they were exposed to it every single day. So that's what I was interested in figuring out. Like, what are you doing to cope with that? Because it's not going away. Um, and what I found was religion was a very big part of that. A number of them leaned on their religion, but also their church body, and it was something other than work. So absolutely, um, a lot of them detached, some in more healthy ways than others. Some just, they'd go out for dinner 3 hours from the house because they didn't want to run into anybody that knew them, and they didn't want to talk about the tornado. So the funniest thing was one of the meteorologists that worked at one of the stations took off to the lake nearby. I mean, not nearby, it was a little distance, because he just wanted to get away and just needed to clear his mind, whatever. And he's out there and he said, there's a lot of people camping. So they have like these big group campfires and whatnot. And they're all sitting around the campfire, and they were all from Joplin talking about the tornado. Like, you didn't go
Oh,
far
man.
enough. So, and family was a very big part of that, whether it's a spouse or, a significant other, a parent, whatever, but some sort of family member who can kind of help ground you and just give you a different perspective. One of the other things I thought was really interesting, and I can totally see this for journalists, but it was writing. A lot of them found writing very cathartic. Like, as they were telling people's stories, even though they were in the midst of it, they felt like they were helping and they were sharing that story. So while it's not necessarily a full release from work, there is a way to find that health in what you're doing too. It has to do with your mindset and how you're approaching the stories.
And I will say, I think now where I'm at in my career, the your mindset and changing of how you view and look at things, I'm learning that it's all your mind, it's all
It is.
mental.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's taken some time for me to learn that, if you go through an event like this, or you cover, like, depending on how you approach it will be depending on the outcome of your work.
Right.
And it's something so simple, but like when you're on the day-to-day grind, you don't think you sometimes you just go into like this like remote um work setting in your brain, and it's just like, go, like, here's, like, you just got to knock it out so you can like make slot, which is like you can make sure your package is in on time. And then you just like, that's it, like you're just so focused on just getting it. And like, and I'm guilty of that for sure, of just,
Oh, yeah.
you know
Everybody is in
yeah.
that field. One of the other things that I found that's very interesting, but as I started to study a little bit more in this field, and I actually am a chaplain through Christ in Action, a lay chaplain through Christ in Action, which is I call it first response for mental health on the chaplain side, but they go in and they're an organization out of Manassas, Virginia, and they go into disaster scenes, mostly natural disasters, but they also responded to the Pentagon after 9/11, that sort of thing. They sometimes will provide food, they'll tear houses down, they'll take construction down that's been damaged, whatever, that's how they help. And they started to realize that there was a need for mental health help for these people because they're in shock. And there are certain things you should do and should not do when you are in a situation that's fresh like that. And I think journalists can fall under that umbrella. Like, you don't make decisions for like 2 weeks. Don't make any major decisions, especially within like 24 hours. But something as simple as making sure that you've had enough to eat and that it's healthy. It's not, chips and pizza and soda and whatever. It's healthy. Making sure you're getting enough water, making sure you're getting enough sleep. Comes into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And this was established, I think, like in the 40s. it's extremely relevant in this field of research, because we need to understand that if we're not caring for ourselves at the most basic levels, we're not going to function at the top of that.
And to kind of to be an example of that, when I remember when I was covering Pulse, we were doing like 14-hour days, like just like, and it was hot. Like this happened June, June. So it was hot. I mean, it's like I remember like being in my button down shirt, like things are like it was just like you're sweating and it's hot, and I don't think I ate that whole like those days.
Yeah.
Like you don't like because you can't leave. You're like literally stuck. And I remember there was like people passing out like water, like, hey, like here's some water. And I was like, thank you. Chug, 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 get back to work. Because you're like literally like you can't leave. You can't and I mean like mentally when you're in this adrenaline stage of life, when you're just like working, you don't get hungry. Like
No,
you're not
you don't
hungry.
think about
You're not
it.
you and then I do remember that there's times even now when I'll work and I'll like, I'll have a 12-hour day and I didn't have like a bottle of water, or I have not eaten since like 7 a.m. and it's 7 p.m. and I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder I'm so hungry. And yeah, it's
Yeah.
true. So I can attest to what you say because
Well, and along those lines, one of the things that you could do as a journalist is kind of have a go bag.
yeah,
Have 6 bottles of water in a bag, some granola bars, some trail mix, beef jerky, which might dehydrate you a little bit, but at least it's some protein, peanut butter, stuff that will keep. But you can, like, because you never know when these are going to happen. That's the problem. At least in Florida, we know when there's a hurricane coming. When I lived in Tornado Alley, we didn't know when they were coming, other than we kind of knew when the season was. So, but this is one of the things they encourage us as chaplains to do, is have go bags, because if we're driving down the street and there's a massive fire or something and we want to pull over and help, one of the first things you should do is care for the person's basic physical needs. So as journalists, I mean, we eat fast food all the time because we're on the road, right? I say we because I'm acting like I'm still a journalist.
you are at heart. You are.
That's right. That's right. But when I was first reporting, especially, I mean, we ate on the road all the time. So if you can prepare a little bit ahead of time and have stuff like that, at least you know what's coming. Like, you have something. I'm sorry. You even if you don't know what's coming, you have something to protect yourself on those very basic physical needs. Our news director at my last station was phenomenal at this. And when we knew when blizzards were coming, so we'd prepare, but our teams would go out, and if we knew that it was supposed to be a big blizzard, we'd park them at hotels so that they had a place to sleep, or they do their live shots from the hotels, gathering information on the phone, because you can't drive. The roads are closed. But he would come in. I remember the back of the newsroom would just be lined with snacks, healthy snacks. And the teams would go back and take what they needed so that they had something, so that they weren't out there with, nothing to eat or whatever. So
I will say, covering hurricanes, they do prepare, but then it gets to a point when it's like day 2 or 3 and you can't really drive, or you're being sent all over like the coast.
Yeah.
And sometimes like you do have a go bag, but then it's like it's usually trail mix, granola bars,
and you're
that's
real
it.
sick of it by
And then
second
you're
day,
like
yeah.
day 3, I'm like, all right, like I need something new. I need like food to like.
But at least you
nourish
got through those first couple days. Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's especially when you're covering natural disasters, you don't know what's gonna happen. Like you do know that like something will come, but you don't know the extent, the gravity. I remember one time I was covering a hurricane and our car died, like right in the middle, and everyone's leaving and we're going towards like where like the hurricane's hitting, and I'm like, all right, like the car just died, like we had to wait, and they're like, hey, just wait until like we get logistics figured out, and we just like me and the other person looked at each other, we're like, well, like I guess. Like, this is, like, kind of what we go through. That's a little traumatic within itself.
Yeah,
You're just like,
it is.
oh, my gosh, like, am I going to make it out alive?
Everybody else is running out
Yeah.
and we're running toward it. That's typically what journalists do.
Yeah, it's an adventure for sure.
I think one of the biggest things that needs to happen, and I love that we touched on like what individuals can do, because I think that right now that's where we are in this industry. It's an individualization.
Absolutely.
You have to know how to care for yourself because nobody else is watching out for you. But what needs to happen overall is that management, owners, corporations, whatever, they have got to start looking at what's going on with their journalists mentally. It's a very stressful industry. It's fun, especially if you're an adrenaline junkie, because it's go, 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 go. Every day is different. You get to write and tell people stories. You get to do things other people don't get to do. It's a very exciting job. It's a lot of fun. But along with that comes the stress of it, just the everyday stress of hitting those deadlines. And, then there's breaking news and your story's out the window and you got to start over. And, oh, and hey, here's a mass shooting you have to go cover for a week. And I just think it's important that owners, management, whatever, are starting to look at the bigger picture of not just getting the job done, but caring for the employee so that the job is done well. That's just
And
my take.
I think the industry is changing in the sense that I know back in the day, and even like early 2000s, it was acceptable for upper management to belittle and kind of
Oh yeah,
also add to the mental I guess
absolutely.
the problems with mental health with reporters.
There was some bullying going on in newsrooms.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah.
And I think now in the times that we live, when there's so much movement with like Me Too, or with like harassment and things like that, where that's all had to kind of take a back seat, because now people are stepping up and saying like, hey, like this is not only like messing around with like my health, but also mentally. Like it's something, you get degraded in front of like your coworkers. It's like, what do you do?
Yeah.
Like, what do you say? You
Mhm.
can't say, you can't stand up because you fear of losing your job.
Right.
And then it's one of those things that, you kind of get stuck and you don't know what to do. So I think it's interesting because locally, like the business is changing, and, I think management still has a long way to go, but I think
They're
they're
trying.
trying to like an extent
I
figure
agree.
out how to not kind of get on a high horse and continue to have that type of attitude or create a toxic environment like that in
Right.
newsrooms, because that's all it was pretty much for
Yes,
the
it was.
longest.
I totally agree with that.
If people are curious to dig more into the topic of trauma in journalism and journalists dealing with trauma, those kind of things, whether it's war journalism or domestic or whatever, what are some just quick resources people can go to if they want to research a little more into it?
So there are two really, really solid organizations that I would recommend. DART Center for Journalism and Trauma,
That's DART.
DART. Yep. It's based out of Columbia University in New York. Now it used to be out of Washington State. That's all they do, and they care for mental health of journalists all over the world. I'm particularly interested in domestic because war is kind of obvious, and I think we're missing what's not obvious. So there's not quite as much attention there, but there is some. Lots and lots and lots of resources on there, and it's just a great organization. And the other one is Pointer. It's Poynter, and they're in here in Florida. They do more training for journalists, but this is definitely becoming a topic of conversation a little more regularly on their list of resources. So they're both excellent.
Great. And we will have additional resources in the bio
Yes.
for this podcast, both things that we've referenced and not, including the Dart Center and Pointer. But I do think that's all the time we have today. Thank you both again for your time. And for more information on the topics we've covered, please visit the links below, like we said, and be sure to visit WFTV.com for our guest, Johny Fernandez. And you can visit cam.seu.edu for more about myself, Professor Adrienne Garvey, the Department of Communication, or the College of Arts and Media. Our website, cam.seu.edu or cam.seu.edu, is where you can sign up for the College of Arts and Media's newsletter to stay up to date on the events and happenings within the College of Arts and Media, whether you're a student, parent, staff, faculty, or community member. And if you would like to support CAM, any of our department's events or extracurricular opportunities like study abroads or chances for students to learn more real-life experience about what they're going to go into upon graduation, visit cam.su.edu, hover over Friends of CAM in the navigation menu, and click on Legacy Partners for more information on how you can support and contribute to excellence in private Christian liberal arts education. And visit SEU.edu for more information about Southeastern University in general or the other 5 colleges at Southeastern, in addition to the College of Arts and Media. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time.